So I'm Kyle, my partner is Antonio, and our project is Coastal Freight Resilience. So hurricanes can cause significant economic and physical impacts to ports and landside freight connections due to their high wind speeds and inundating storm surges and flooding. This issue is increasingly relevant as this year's Atlantic hurricane season was the most active on record. This has the potential to greatly impact ports along the Texas Gulf Coast. Therefore, our project seeks to model how a seaport system of systems is impacted by a hurricane disruption. We will model a port facility based on the port of Port Arthur, Texas, and we are specifically examining how container imports are impacted by hurricanes. Within our Seaport SOS, we are considering three main systems: maritime freight, port terminal operations, and landside connections of trucking. The table at the right shows the various components that are to be included in the model. In our initial framework, railroad operations were included as well. However, this system ultimately did not make it into the final model for reasons we will discuss later. This image shows how the different systems and components of a Seaport SOS are interrelated. The waterside system represents maritime components such as ships, navigable waterways, and dockside berths. Port terminal facilities include assets such as cranes, cargo moving components like forklifts, and dock storage space. Finally, landside connections include freight, highway, trucking. The hurricane disruptor affects the status quo through hazards such as seabed silting, high winds, and flooding. These are the interdependencies identified in our SOS. We decided to focus on the loading and unloading operations of the port terminal, following cargo as it travels into the terminal through vessel traffic and then is unloaded, stored, and loaded onto trucks for delivery. There are also out-of-scope systems that are not included in our model due to data availability, are static during storm disruptions, are seasonal, or they represent externalities. For our methodology, our initial approach was to use agent-based modeling to capture the interactions of the various agents and represent the different states of functionality on the agent state charts. However, as we began our modeling process, we realized that a seaport is better represented as a discrete event model, since the function of a seaport is based on processes for moving goods. Therefore, we adjusted our modeling process to represent the seaport functions as a discrete event simulation. The arrival of a ship triggers an ordered sequence of events for cargo handling, from crane operations to container storage, and truck loading and delivery as shown by the paper process model on the right. Ultimately, our model ended up becoming more like a sensitivity analysis, where we modeled the status quo of the seaport and then changed parameters to represent a hurricane scenario and observed the results on port throughput. Here's an image of our final model. The flowchart at the bottom details the actions and processes for the ships entering the port. When a ship reaches the unloading block, 60 containers are injected into the source container block in the top flowchart. This top flowchart represents the container and truck processes. An assembler block is used to represent a truck being loaded with a container. Then the loaded truck leaves the port. A combination of conveyors, queues, and delay blocks are used to model the trucks and container processes. The hurricane disruption is introduced to the model via user input push buttons. Clicking on the hurricane button creates changes in the arrival rate of the ships and trucks, while also altering the functionality of the crane and adjusting the time spent in port for the ships. The parameters were changed according to available data and values found in literature. Clicking on the status quo button reverts the parameters back to their initial values. This user input feature allows the modeler to control when a hurricane happens and for how long the hurricane impacts may last. This is a view of the simulation window in AnyLogic. There are many elements present, such as an aerial image of the port, which was used for spatial markup, statistics plots to track the number of ships and containers in the port, and the DES flowchart representing the model processes and more. These videos provide brief overviews of the model running. On the left is the simulation window for the final increments of the model, and on the right is a 3D view of a ship unloading containers to the warehouse. The model was run for a total of 80,000 minutes, which is about 60 days or approximately 2 months. To observe the impact of a storm, the hurricane button was pressed at 40,000 minutes and then turned off at 70,000 minutes. You can think of 10,000 minutes as being roughly equal to 1 week. So this is equivalent to running the model for about 4 weeks, placing a hurricane disruptor in the system for 3 weeks, and then removing it for 1 week. The results show a decrease in port throughput capacity of around 20% for containers over the 2-month period due to the 3-week-long disruption caused by the hurricane and the recovery period. These types of losses would be detrimental to any port facility. This model also does not account for direct losses due to damaged equipment, so it is clear that the impact of hurricanes on container cargo imports is significant.
So We selected the presence of severe hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico as our disruption. The general idea is to identify events in the process diagram that could see their duration affected by the hazards listed in the table. In summary, the disruptor diminishes functionality or alters the arrival rate of various components in the model. To get into the specifics, the arrival of vessels, one of the input variables for our system, goes down during the hurricane season. But they also affect the performance of common activities within the port, like how much time takes to unload cargo from the vessels. So this information characterizes the system. We require several data types. The hurricane timeline from the last 3 years was used to pinpoint periods where the system could have been disrupted. One of our main data sources is vessel tracking data, and that comes from the Coast Guard, which publishes AIS data containing timestamp locations every 3 to 4 minutes, which allows for the characterization needed for a model. Truck traffic data was not available for this region, so a reasonable number of 1 truck per hour was assumed, as this will amount to 20,000 trucks per year using the port. This total is within the range of similar sized ports in the area for which data is available. Finally, data from local news and available publications about the port was used to cite some aspects of the model, like assuming that vessels only do unloading in Port Arthur, as it is likely that they load cargo in bigger ports. Just to focus more about the AIS data points were clipped to a mass defining berth areas. These are the white rectangles in the picture. The timestamp from every record is then used to identify the moment when each vessel enters the port service area and when it abandons the system. Not everything is perfect, and data from 2018 and 2019 was removed from the characterizations due to irregularities likely caused by construction happening at this time. Finally, time of service was fed to a gamma distribution in the status quo model and to a beta distribution for the disrupted model, and a statistical test for both fittings supported its use for characterization. The NASA validation and verification criteria was used to assess our model development. The data pedigree has a level 2, as some of the input data is specific to Port Arthur and has been subject to statistical testing, but some other, like trucks arrival rates and the specific crane service duration, had to be assumed. We assign a score of 1 for the verification of as the drop of containers entering the system while disrupted keeps in line with what you expect when having less vessels arrive. Finally, the validation level is classified as 2. The annual TEU is well within the range of the port of a port this size when compared to other providers in the region. In terms of the limitations, we had initially planned to focus on 2 main cargo types using one single model: container shipment via trucks and dry bulk shipment via train. But we ran into some issues as the PLE edition of AnyLogic limits the number of agent types and train simulations time. We attempted to fix these issues by creating a separate model for the grain terminal and trains, but we were not able to find a solution within our time constraints. In terms of the geographic scope, it's possible to think about one of the closest ports being shut down during a hurricane and demand being redirected to Port Arthur, but this geographic dependency is not included in the model. We conclude that without a doubt, usual metrics for port performance are affected during the hurricane season, and thinking about how a disruption affects events in the discrete event model is the separation between which events in the sequence are affected. A stakeholder in the port can easily say yes when it rains, this process is delayed. And being that the case, it's also intuitive to think about which agents, if any, need to increase robustness. For future work, we think that this initial model provides building blocks for further analysis. Future work could be completed using the full AnyLogic license with more agent types. Building in complexity by adding the dry bulk freight type and railroad connections will add further detail to the SOS model, and additional aspects such as expanding the geographic scope of the project to include highway and railway networks will also improve the model. And these are our references. Thank you.